In this video, we're going to take a look at how the case study risk assessments that we're using relate to that original risk assessment model that was promulgated by the National Research Council back in 1983. So we're going to begin with GLMRIS. But before doing that, let me review those 4 steps for you that were in the so-called Red Book, where we got the first risk assessment model, the first conceptual risk assessment model, that has been basically the grandfather of all the risk assessment models that have sprung forth from it in the years since then. So they originally had 4 steps. There was a hazard identification. Second step was a dose response, and because they were dealing with chemicals in the environment for the most part, they were looking at a very specific kind of adverse human health effect, and that was cancer in human beings. So they were looking at the different adverse health responses that were associated with different doses. So the dose response was the grandfather of the hazard characterization or the consequence assessment. The third step was the exposure assessment. And the exposure assessment basically described the sequence of events that was necessary for a person to consume a dose of a chemical. And so the exposure assessment has become the grandfather of the likelihood assessments. And exposure assessment is still a widely used phrase. Finally, the 4th step was the risk characterization. So now we turn to GLMRIS. And in GLMRIS, they began with a very long list of aquatic alien species. And if I flip through this for you just quickly, you get the idea of the size of this file. It's over 200 different species that were examined to try to determine which of these were of greatest potential risk concern. So as it turned out, there were 34 species from over the 200 that were identified as of potential high risk. Each of these species was in turn reviewed. You see here a paper that gives you an idea of the literature search that went behind each of these. So this was the hazard identification step. This screening process took the 200 plus alien species and identified 34 that were of potential concern. So that would be the hazard identification step, and that remains pretty much the same in many communities of practice. There has to be some means by which you identify the specific hazards. Now we're going to turn to, let's see, we're going to take a look at the corollary or the analogy to the dose response. The dose response step is where the consequences were identified. That dose response step, its name has evolved over time. It's now more commonly called the hazard characterization. In our generic model that we're using in class, we call it the consequence assessment. So for the GLMRIS study, the consequence assessment is described here in this part of the risk assessment methodology report. What I would like you to see, don't worry about the details, there were several consequences identified. Environmental consequences, which you see here, effects on ecosystem structure and function. There were economic consequences, effects on economic activities. There were social and political consequences. And because this is a qualitative risk assessment, there was a means by which the other 3 consequences could be combined into an overall consequence assessment. If we were to scroll down through here, and I'm going to go very quickly through, you would see that for each species there would be a qualitative rating of the consequences, from high through medium and low to no consequence at all. These ratings would be assigned based on the available evidence and literature. And you can see here in the risk assessment methodology, there is a significant discussion of the nature of these different consequences. We were just skipping through the environmental consequences. Economic consequences are similarly discussed, as are the social political consequences. So this would be the analogy to the second step in the Red Book methodology. The third step is the exposure assessment. The exposure assessment is the sequence of events that's necessary for the consequences to occur, and in the present case, that would be the probability of establishment. So in the GLMRIS study, that activity that would typically be called the exposure assessment is the probability of establishment. You can see here that the probability is broken down into the 5 steps that we've talked about a few other times. These are defined here. The various probabilities. They are also rated qualitatively from high through none, and then they are aggregated up to an overall probability of establishment. So this is all done in a qualitative manner. The definitions of the probabilities you would find here in the methodology, and in the overall probability of establishment. And the point that I would like to make right now is that every risk assessment has some version of these 4 steps, and that's important to understand. The 4th step is the risk characterization. For that, we're going to go on over to the risk assessment itself, and we're going to take a look at the risk characterization for silver carp. So what you'll see here is a summary of the evidence that was available to help the risk assessors rate those consequences and the probability of establishment. So, for example, this begins with the discussion of the native range and the current distribution of the silver carp. Its life history and ecology are included, and then it turns to the probability of establishment. This is where the specific information that was used to come up with these ratings for the 5 components is found. This can be an overwhelming risk assessment to study simply because of its size. So let me just briefly take one example here. We have 5 different pathways, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the Chicago area. Excuse me. And for each pathway, we have 4 different time frames, and they are time 0, 10 years in the future, 25 years in the future, and then 50 years in the future. For each of these, we have a pathway rating. Here you can see at time 0 in pathway 1, the pathway is rated high. There is no uncertainty. So the values in parentheses here would be an uncertainty rating. And excuse me, as you go down the column, you see we have a high pathway, high arrival, low passage, high colonization, high spread, and that's an overall probability of establishment of low. Each of these columns gives a different rating. You can see as time passes, once we get 25 years into the future, the overall probability of establishment has increased from a low to a medium. This table that you're looking at here is summarizing the work that was done in the likelihood assessment, and that would be analogous to the exposure assessment activity. Okay? We now turn to the consequences of establishment, and these next several pages, as we look down here in the middle of the page, you can see there are high consequences to the environment with medium uncertainty, high consequences to the economy with medium uncertainty, high consequences to social political values with medium uncertainty, and the overall consequence value is high. The pages that follow include the evidence that was used to develop those ratings, and we come up with finally the risk characterization, and that's what we've been after in this step now. So the risk characterization step is found here, where they talk about the risk of the adverse impacts, pulling together the information from the consequence assessment and the likelihood assessment. So here's where you'll see the final results, the risk characterization. With a low probability of establishment and high consequences, the overall risk is low, low, medium, and 50 years into the future, medium. Each row now gives the risk associated with silver carp for each of the 5 pathways into Lake Michigan. So here's what I would like you to take away from this. We are talking about some very specific kinds of activities that take place in every risk assessment in this module. If we were to go back to the traditional, the original risk assessment model that was in most common usage in the United States, these 2 activities would be called hazard characterization and exposure assessment. Understand that different communities of practice use different words, but every risk assessment model has to attend to these 2 activities. They have to assess the consequences by some means. They have to assess the likelihood of those consequences occurring by some means. And then, in that final step of risk characterization, somehow they have to integrate those 2 bodies of knowledge and do that in a way that answers the questions that the risk managers are asking about the risks that they're trying to manage.